Daniel Carter gripped the steering wheel with one hand while wiping the fog from the inside of the windshield with the other. His rusted pickup truck wheezed its way down the slick, two-lane road as sheets of cold rain battered the glass. The windshield wipers groaned in protest, doing their best to swat away the flood pouring from the heavens. It was late, close to 9:30 p.m., and Daniel's back ached from the double shift he'd just pulled at Joe's garage. His stomach was empty, his hands were stained with oil, and the idea of another meal of canned soup and instant noodles made him sigh heavily. But he didn't complain. He never did, not anymore. At 38, Daniel had the wary eyes of someone who'd lived twice his years. Life hadn't just handed him lemons, it had hurled them at him with brutal precision. 2 years ago, his wife Amy passed away from ovarian cancer. It was fast, aggressive, and relentless, just like the bills that followed her death. Since then, every morning was a battle to get out of bed, not for himself, but for his 6-year-old son Max. Max, with his curious eyes and gap-toothed smile, was the only flicker of light in Daniel's storm-ridden life. The truck slowed as he approached the old bus stop on the outskirts of town. The streetlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the empty bench. Or at least, he thought it was empty, until he saw a figure huddled under the awning. Daniel's foot eased onto the brake, curiosity tugging at the edges of his fatigue. There, sitting motionless on the wooden bench, was a girl. She looked young, no more than 19 or 20, with long, drenched hair clinging to her face. Her hoodie was too thin for the storm, soaked through and stuck to her frail frame. Her jeans were torn at the knees, her sneakers muddied. She didn't flinch as the headlights washed over her. She just stared at the pavement, arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Daniel's first instinct was to keep driving. He had enough trouble of his own. He didn't have room in his life, or his wallet, for strangers. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way her shoulders trembled uncontrollably. Maybe it was the haunting stillness in her posture. Or maybe it was the fact that, once upon a time, someone had stopped for him when he thought no one would. He sighed and pulled over. He rolled down the window slightly. "You okay out there?" he called through the rain. The girl lifted her head slowly, eyes wary and red. She didn't answer. "You waiting for a bus?" he asked again. She gave a small shake of her head. "No, not really." Daniel hesitated. He knew better than to get involved. But he also knew what it felt like to be abandoned by the world. "I'm not a cop or anything," he said, voice softer now. "Just heading home. My kid's waiting on me. Look, I don't mean to scare you, but you can't sit out here all night. It's freezing. You need a place to warm up." Her eyes narrowed with suspicion, but there was no fire in them. Just a hollow kind of exhaustion. She didn't move. "I've got soup on the stove," he offered, though he didn't, and a dry blanket. Still no answer. Daniel exhaled sharply and turned off the engine. He got out, pulled his jacket tighter, and walked toward her slowly. When he reached her, she tensed. "I won't touch you," he said gently. I can't leave you here." She looked at him then. Really looked. Her face was pale, lips chapped, and her eyes carried more pain than any 19-year-old should ever know. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lena," she whispered, barely audible over the rain. "I'm Daniel. You want to come with me, Lena?" For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, finally, she gave the faintest nod. Daniel opened the truck door and waited as she climbed in slowly, shivering violently. She didn't speak during the ride. She didn't ask where they were going. She just stared out the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as though holding in pieces that might otherwise fall apart. When they reached his modest home, an old one-story with peeling paint and a crooked mailbox, Daniel hurried ahead to unlock the door. Inside, the living room was cluttered with toys, laundry baskets, and the faint scent of mac and cheese. Max was asleep on the couch, a blanket draped over him and a dinosaur plushie tucked under his arm. Daniel turned on the heater, handed Leno a towel, and fetched an oversized hoodie from Amy's old box of clothes in the attic. She changed in the bathroom, emerging a few minutes later looking even smaller in the baggy sweatshirt. He handed her a bowl of tomato soup, actually from a can this time, and gestured toward the couch. She sat gingerly, barely touching the cushion, and ate in silence. Max stirred and sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes. "Dad, who's that?" "This is Lena," Daniel said, glancing at her. "She's a friend. She's staying with us for a little while." Max blinked, then offered her a sleepy smile. "Hi." Lena blinked at him, unsure how to respond. "Hi," she said softly. Daniel tucked Max into bed, kissed his forehead, and returned to the living room. Lena had finished the soup and placed the bowl neatly on the coffee table. "You didn't have to do this," she murmured. "No one should be left out in the cold." Daniel replied. She lowered her gaze. "I don't have anywhere else to go. You can stay here, at least until you figure things out." Her eyes welled up, but she wiped them quickly. "You don't even know me." Daniel gave a tired smile. "You remind me of someone I once knew. Someone who deserved better." That night, Lena slept in the small guest room. Daniel heard her crying through the walls, quiet sobs muffled by a pillow. He wanted to knock, to tell her it would be okay, but he knew words wouldn't fix what she'd been through. All he could do was leave a glass of water by her door and keep the hallway light on. In the morning, she was up early. He found her sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded in her lap. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her. "You don't have to talk about it," he said. "But if you ever want to, I'm here." She stared into her cup, steam rising between them. "My parents sold me," she said finally. "To a man they barely knew. Said it was an arranged marriage. Said it would give them money and get rid of the burden." Daniel's stomach twisted. "I ran," she continued. "After 2 weeks, I couldn't take it anymore. I thought I'd rather die in the cold than go back." Daniel didn't speak. He couldn't. Rage boiled beneath his skin, but he forced himself to stay calm. "You're not a burden," he said after a long pause. "Not here." Lena looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of hope touched her eyes. "I don't know how to be anything anymore," she whispered. "Not a daughter. Not a person. I don't even know who I am." "You're Lena," Daniel said gently. "And you're safe now." In the days that followed, Lena kept mostly to herself. She helped around the house, washing dishes, folding laundry, tidying up. She was quiet, always moving carefully as if afraid of taking up too much space. Max, on the other hand, was enamored with her. He'd follow her around, asking questions, showing her drawings, and inviting her to play board games. Slowly, her silence began to crack. One afternoon, Max asked her to read him a story. She hesitated, but he handed her a book and climbed into her lap, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Daniel watched from the doorway as Lena's voice, shaky at first, grew steady with each page. Max leaned against her, completely at ease. That night, after Max went to bed, Lena lingered in the kitchen as Daniel washed the dishes. "Your son, he's kind. He's got his mother's heart," Daniel replied. "She was the best part of me." Lena hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever stop missing her?" "No," he said quietly, "but I've learned to live with the missing." Lena nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I want to get a job," she said suddenly. "Pay for food. Help out. I can't just take from you." "You're not taking," he replied. "But if working helps you feel in control again, I'll help you find something." She smiled, a small, uncertain smile, but real. By the end of the 2nd week, she was laughing softly at Max's jokes. By the 3rd, she joined Daniel on grocery runs and started cooking small meals. The house, once hollow and heavy with grief, began to feel alive again. Daniel didn't know what Lena's long-term plans were. He didn't know if she'd stay or if she'd eventually leave to build her own life. But he knew this much: in the quiet hours of the evening, as the house filled with the sounds of clinking dishes, Max's giggles, and Lena's soft humming, the ache in his chest eased. She came to him a ghost of herself. Broken, abandoned, forgotten. But already, Daniel could see it, the miracle forming quietly in the shadows. A girl learning to trust again, a boy gaining a sister. A father finding something he didn't know he'd lost hope. And though he couldn't say it out loud yet, Daniel knew something else deep in his bones. Lena hadn't just needed saving. So had he. The days passed slowly but steadily, each one subtly stitching new threads into the fabric of Daniel Carter's broken home. What had once felt like a silent, grief-soaked fortress now hummed with the quiet stirrings of something unspoken. A sense of possibility, a whisper of hope, a fragile truce with the past. Lena, the mysterious and wounded girl he had taken in from a rain-soaked bus stop, was becoming less of a stranger and more of a presence. Not quite family, not yet, but no longer just a guest. She had been there for 3 weeks. The quiet girl who flinched at every knock and kept her back to the wall during conversations was starting to uncoil, slowly, like a frozen river learning to flow again under the first touch of spring. Daniel noticed it in the way she stood a little straighter when she spoke. He saw it in how she didn't immediately recoil from Max's hugs anymore. And more than anything, he heard it in the sound of her laughter, rare and soft, like the tinkling of wind chimes after a long silence. One Saturday morning, Daniel found Lena seated at the kitchen table, scribbling something in a worn notebook. The sunlight poured through the curtains and highlighted the soft, brown strands of her hair, now washed and brushed neatly behind her ears. She didn't hear him enter until he gently cleared his throat. "You journaling?" he asked, wiping his hands on a dish towel. She looked up, startled, but relaxed when she saw it was him. "Just writing things down. It helps me think." Daniel nodded, unsure what else to say. She hadn't shared much about what she'd gone through. Not in specifics, anyway. But he'd never pressed. Trust wasn't a gift, it was a seed, and he knew it had to be watered with patience and time. "You sleep okay?" he asked, grabbing his coffee mug. "Better," she said. "I don't lock the door anymore." That admission caught him off guard. He raised his eyebrows but didn't push. Instead, he gave her a quiet nod of understanding, then poured his coffee and joined her at the table. "I was thinking of applying at the diner on 3rd Street, she said after a moment. "I walked by yesterday when I took Max to the park. They had a sign up, the Blue Bell Cafe." She nodded. "They're good people," he said. "Jane runs it. She's tough but fair." "Think you're ready?" Lena looked down at her hands. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready. But I can't keep pretending this isn't my life now. I need to do something with it." Daniel admired that. Strength wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it looked like a 19-year-old girl standing up with trembling knees, saying she wanted to work, to belong, to reclaim her stolen self. "Let's go tomorrow," he said. "I'll introduce you." The next day, Daniel kept his word. The Blue Bell Cafe smelled of fresh cinnamon rolls and brewing coffee. The walls were adorned with faded photos of local festivals and town baseball teams. Jane, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with a gravelly voice and a sharp wit, eyed Lena carefully but listened as Daniel introduced her. "She's smart," he said. "Quick learner. Honest, and she could use the break." Jane didn't ask questions. She offered Lena a trial shift the next morning. Lena accepted with a quiet, grateful nod. That night, Lena stood in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing her hair nervously, smoothing down the second-hand blouse Daniel had bought her from the thrift store. "You look great," Max said, watching from the hallway with wide, proud eyes. "Thanks, Maxie," she said, her voice cracking just a little. The next few days changed everything. Lena started working at the cafe 3 days a week, weekday mornings and 1 weekend shift. She was clumsy at first, nervous around the regulars, always double-checking orders. But she was kind and careful. She remembered names. She smiled at the elderly, chatted with the children, and listened more than she spoke, and little by little, she earned their respect. When she brought home her first paycheck, she placed it directly in Daniel's hand. "This is yours," she insisted, "for the food, the electricity, the kindness." Daniel looked at the crumpled envelope in his palm, then at the girl standing before him, fragile and brave. "You keep it," he said gently. "Put some away. Save some. Use a little to buy something that makes you feel good." She looked like she might cry again. But instead, She nodded and tucked it into her journal. Things began to fall into a rhythm. Mornings were filled with laughter as Max hurried to get ready for school, Lena tossing him his lunch bag while Daniel adjusted his coat. Afternoons were quieter. Lena would return from the cafe tired but content, and Daniel would come home greasy and bone, weary from the garage. Evenings were the best. They cooked together. Simple meals like spaghetti or grilled cheese, and sometimes watched old movies on the battered couch, Max curled up between them. One evening, after dinner, Lena stood on the back porch, watching the sunset. Daniel stepped outside with 2 mugs of tea and handed her one. "I never used to like quiet," she said softly, wrapping her hands around the mug. "Back where I was?" Silence meant something bad was about to happen. Daniel leaned on the railing beside her. "And now, she said after a moment, "I think silence feels like peace." They stood there, the orange glow bathing their faces, the breeze whispering through the trees. It wasn't a grand moment, but it was real. And for Lena, real was something she hadn't had in a very long time. Over time, she started doing more around the house. She organized the kitchen cabinets, planted flowers in the small garden bed out front, and helped Max with his reading. Daniel noticed that Max no longer cried for his mother at night. Instead, he talked about Lena, how she helped him build Lego castles and told the funniest bedtime stories. It was subtle, but it meant something. Still, healing wasn't linear. There were setbacks, like the time a man walked into the diner with a voice too loud, a laugh too cruel, and Lena had to run to the back and hide in the supply closet for 20 minutes. Or the night a car backfired in the street, and she bolted upright from sleep, trembling and gasping for air. Daniel never asked for details. He just sat outside her door until she opened it, offered her a glass of water, and reminded her, "You're safe. You're home." Lena started opening up more. Late one night, after Max had gone to bed, she sat at the kitchen table and shared her story. More than the vague outlines she'd first given. She spoke of the months before her parents sold her, how they had grown distant, angry, as if she were a problem they couldn't solve. She talked about the man she had been married to, an older man who locked her indoors, took her phone, forced her to act like a trophy rather than a person. "I was screaming inside every day," she said, her voice cracking. "And when I escaped, I thought no one would believe me. I still think, maybe I'm broken in ways I can't fix." Daniel's heart ached with every word. "You're not broken," he said firmly. "You're bruised, yeah, but bruises heal." She looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "How do you know?" "Because I've been there," he admitted. "When Amy died, I didn't think I could go on. I wanted to give up. But Max needed me, so I kept breathing, even when it hurt." Lena looked at the table, tracing the edge with her finger. "You saved me, Daniel." "No," he said. "You saved yourself. I just gave you a place to land." After that night, something shifted between them. The silence became companionable. The home felt fuller. Lena began making plans. She signed up for GED prep classes at the community center and started researching grants for college. She talked about studying psychology. "So I can help girls like me," she said. Girls who didn't get out. Daniel didn't say it aloud, but he felt it in his bones. Lena wasn't just a survivor. She was becoming someone extraordinary. On a Sunday afternoon in late spring, Max ran into the kitchen shouting, "Can we go to the lake, please? Please. It's warm and Lena's never been." Lena laughed. "You've got a lot of energy today, Maxie." "We can pack a lunch," he insisted. "Please." Daniel looked between the two of them and smiled. "All right, let's go." They spent the day at the lake, skipping stones, eating sandwiches on a blanket, and watching Max splash in the shallow end. Lena stood at the water's edge, the sunlight kissing her cheeks, and let out a laugh so unguarded, so joyful, that it took Daniel's breath away. For the first time since Amy's death, he felt a strange warmth in his chest. Not grief, not longing, but something new, something like peace. That night, as Lena tucked Max into bed, he yawned and looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Are you gonna stay forever?" She paused, heart caught in her throat. I don't know, she whispered. Would you want that? Max nodded. You're like my big sister now. She kissed his forehead and turned off the light, tears glistening in her eyes. Downstairs, she found Daniel sipping tea on the couch. She sat beside him, silent for a moment, then said, I never thought I'd feel like I belonged anywhere again. Daniel looked at her, his voice low and steady. You don't just belong here, Lena. You've made this place whole. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. That night, Daniel stood outside her door, listening for the sound of crying that had become a ritual. There was none, only silence. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was peace, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of a miracle neither of them had seen coming. The house on Oak Ridge Lane no longer echoed with loneliness. It was still small, still needed work. A leaky faucet in the kitchen, a creaky floorboard in the hall. But it breathed differently now. It no longer felt like a place people lived in simply to survive. It felt like home. Daniel, Lena, and Max had settled into a rhythm, unspoken yet familiar. The once temporary presence of Lena had rooted itself firmly in their daily lives, like ivy climbing the edges of a weathered house, weaving its way into every corner without ever being intrusive. Autumn had crept into the town like a whispered promise. The air had turned crisp, the leaves painted shades of amber and crimson, and the smell of cinnamon from the cafe, where Lena worked, drifted home with her in the late afternoons. She had been at the Bluebell Cafe for just over 3 months now. What began as a trial shift had turned into a part-time job, and now Jane was talking about training her for a management position. You've got a head on your shoulders and a fire in your eyes, she told Lena one morning as they arranged muffins in the display case. And you don't take crap from the regulars. That's gold around here. But Lena didn't just want to sling coffee and serve pie forever. Daniel had seen it in her from the beginning, the spark, the hunger, the potential. And she had begun to see it too. Her evenings were spent poring over books, practicing math, writing essays, preparing for her G. She'd set a date to take the exam in early December, and the closer it got, the more fiercely she studied. Daniel would often pass by the dining table late at night and see her hunched over practice tests, brow furrowed in concentration, highlighter in hand, a half-drunk cup of tea at her side. Sometimes he would pause in the hallway and just watch, awed by her determination, the quiet ferocity with which she rebuilt herself. It stirred something in him. Not that. Something warmer, deeper. Respect, pride, maybe even something like love, not romantic, not yet, but a fierce, protective tenderness he hadn't expected to feel again after Amy died. Max, on the other hand, had long since adopted Lena into his life without hesitation. He called her Lenny. Now a nickname he'd invented one day and stuck with. He insisted she sit next to him at dinner, help him with his Lego castles, and read him bedtime stories with silly voices. One evening, Daniel found a drawing Max had made, a crayon family portrait, crooked and colorful. In the center was a smiling stick figure of Daniel with oil smudges on his clothes. To the left, Max himself, holding hands with a figure labeled Lenny, drawn with a pink shirt and big eyes. It made Daniel's throat tighten. They were no longer just a man, his son, and a girl he had rescued. They were something more. But life, Daniel knew, had a way of testing the strength of miracles. It started with a notice in the mail, an abrupt letter from the city informing Daniel that his property taxes were overdue. They had been increasing for years, but he had managed to scrape by with payment plans and careful budgeting. This time, there was no wiggle room. He owed more than he had, and the deadline was tight. He sat at the kitchen table that night long after Max had gone to bed, staring at the paper, a tight knot forming in his chest. His mechanic hours had been cut again due to the shop's slow business, and the school janitor job only paid enough to cover food, gas, and the barest essentials. He heard soft footsteps and looked up to see Lena standing in the doorway. "You're still up," she said. He folded the letter and shoved it under a stack of envelopes. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." She walked over and sat across from him. "You're in trouble." He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I'm trying to keep the roof over our heads." but the city's making it harder every year. Let me help, she said immediately. I've got savings. Not much, but I've been putting most of my checks away. You've already done enough, he said firmly. You work, you study, you take care of Max. That's more than anyone could have asked. I'm not anyone. I live here too. This is my home, Daniel. The way she said it stopped him cold. My home. He hadn't realized how much those words would affect him until he heard them spoken by someone who once had no home at all. You're not a guest, he murmured. No, she agreed softly. And you're not alone in this anymore. He wanted to argue, but her eyes, clear, steady, and full of resolve, stilled him. He nodded slowly. Okay, he said. We'll figure it out together. They sat in silence for a while, sipping tea and listening to the creaks of the old house. It was a quiet solidarity, the kind that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. Over the next few weeks, Lena took on extra shifts at the cafe. She also began offering tutoring sessions at the community center on weekends, free for the local kids who needed help with reading or basic math. She was surprised by how many signed up. Word spread quickly. The girl who helps your kid without judging you became something of a town rumor. Jane increased her hours, and soon, she was making more than enough to cover her half of the utilities and groceries, and put some money toward Daniel's tax bill. Daniel, meanwhile, wrestled with guilt. He wasn't used to leaning on anyone. His marriage had been a partnership, yes, but after Amy's passing, he had convinced himself he had to carry everything alone. That if he didn't, the whole thing would fall apart. But Lena wasn't replacing Amy. She was building something new with him, a new kind of family, with its own shape, its own language of comfort and trust. One evening, after a tutoring session, Lena returned home with something in her hand, a flyer, printed on bright paper, slightly crumpled from her bag. You should see this, she said, handing it to Daniel. He squinted at the print. Women Rising Annual Courage Scholarship, for young women under 21 who have overcome adversity and are pursuing education or social advocacy. They're offering full tuition, Lena said, and a chance to intern with their nonprofit. One of the other tutors said I should apply. She knew someone who won last year. Daniel looked at the flyer, then back at her. You should. She hesitated. What if I'm not ready? You're more than ready. You've already been doing the work. The deadline was 2 weeks away. Lena poured her heart into the application. She wrote a personal essay that Daniel read one night when she left it on the table by accident. In it, she didn't shy away from the dark details. She told her story with raw honesty. But she also spoke about healing, about how one man had given her shelter without asking for anything in return, and how his little boy had made her believe in love again. She wrote about the power of safety, of education, of being seen. Daniel wiped his eyes when he finished reading. He didn't say a word about it to her, just gave her a gentle squeeze on the shoulder the next morning as she rushed off to the cafe. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived. Lena didn't open it right away. She stared at it, hands trembling, then walked to the porch where Daniel was fixing the railing. Will you open it with me? She asked. They sat on the steps, side by side, and tore the envelope open. She had won, not just the scholarship, but a position as a paid intern with Women Rising, working with survivors of trafficking and abuse. The program would cover her tuition for the local college's social work program and give her the support she needed to complete her degree. Daniel hugged her. Not awkwardly, not cautiously, but with the full weight of his pride and emotion. Lena clung to him, laughing and crying at the same time. The acceptance letter crumpled between them. Max came running outside. Did we win something? Lana crouched down and held out the letter. I did, Maxie. I get to go to school. He threw his arms around her neck. Does that mean you're not leaving? Lena glanced at Daniel. No, she said, smiling. It means I'm staying. That night, they had a small celebration. Just the three of them, pizza, and a store-bought cake. Max insisted on candles and sang, Happy Graduation, at the top of his lungs. Daniel watched Lena blow out the candles, cheeks flushed with laughter, eyes bright with tears. And in that moment, he knew something with quiet certainty. He had taken her in as a stranger. But she had become the miracle that mended them all. The seasons shifted once more. Winter rolled across the quiet Oregon town like a silent tide, dusting rooftops with snow and frosting the windows of every home. The streets glistened under the cold sky, and the lake, which had once echoed with the joyful splashes of summer afternoons, now lay silent and frozen, a sheet of white stretching across its surface. But inside the Carter house, the cold never quite found its way in. The warmth that had grown steadily over the past months filled the walls, each room carrying the laughter of a boy, the steady footsteps of a man, and the bright, hopeful rhythm of a young woman reclaiming her life. Lena had officially started college in early January. Her classes were mostly online, but she attended a few in-person lectures at the community campus just 20 minutes away. Every morning she woke up early, brewed coffee for Daniel, packed Max's school lunch, and then settled down with her laptop and a stack of highlighters to conquer subjects like sociology, psychology, and social work ethics. She dove into her studies with the same quiet determination she'd once used to survive her darkest nights. Except now, she was building something, not just escaping something. Her internship with Women Rising began a few weeks after classes started. Twice a week, she drove into the city to sit in on group sessions, assist counselors, and help manage outreach programs for survivors of trafficking and abuse. The first time she walked into that building, she froze in the lobby, heart pounding in her chest. But the warmth of the staff, the kindness of other girls, some younger, some older, all scarred in their own ways, steadied her. She wasn't alone. She never had been. And now, she had the strength to be part of the healing. Daniel watched all of this with quiet awe. He still worked at the garage, still mopped the floors of the high school each evening, but life didn't feel like it was dragging him under anymore. Bills still came. Repairs still piled up, but there was something else now, a sense of balance, of momentum. He hadn't just taken in a girl who needed shelter. He'd invited in a second chance. For both of them. The changes weren't just practical, they were emotional too. Daniel and Lena had grown into a kind of closeness that went beyond gratitude or circumstance. They had become partners in the quiet business of healing, their bond rooted in honesty, mutual respect, and a deep, familial affection. There were still moments of awkwardness, moments when their pasts whispered too loudly, when grief or trauma rose up like old ghosts. But they had learned to give each other space, to listen without judgment, and to speak without fear. One night, as they sat on the porch drinking hot chocolate, while Max slept inside, Daniel asked the question that had been quietly burning in his mind for weeks. "Have you thought about seeing them again?" he asked, his voice low. Lena knew what he meant. Her parents. She stared into her mug for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes I wonder if they even think about me. If they ever feel guilt. Or if I'm just forgotten." "You're not forgotten," Daniel said firmly. She nodded, biting her lip. "I don't think I need closure from them anymore. I used to dream of confronting them, screaming, asking why. But now, I think I've accepted that I'll never get answers that satisfy me. And I'm okay with that. I have a new life, a real one." He reached over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're family now. You know that, right?" She looked up at him, eyes shimmering with emotion. "I do." It wasn't just words, it was truth, deep and unshakable. Later that week, Lena received a letter in the mail. It was from her younger cousin, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. The letter was simple, apologetic, and heartfelt. It said that Lena's parents had told the extended family she'd run off, rebelled, and disappeared. But as rumors trickled out and the truth began to surface, people were starting to question everything. Her cousin had heard about Lena's scholarship through a mutual friend and wanted her to know that not everyone had turned their back on her. Lena wept when she read it, quiet, relieved sobs that made Daniel gently sit beside her and hold her hand. It was a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, tiny rays of truth could shine through. Spring approached, and with it came new milestones. Max turned 7. He insisted on having a superhero-themed birthday party, and Lena threw herself into the planning like it was her own event. She handmade decorations, baked cupcakes with bright frosting, and even stitched a cape for Max to wear. Daniel watched the whole thing unfold with a mixture of amazement and disbelief. This girl, this beautiful, resilient girl who had once cowered in the corners of his home, was now dancing around the living room with streamers in her hair and joy in her every movement. The party was a small one. Just a few kids from Max's school, some neighbors, and Jane from the cafe. But it was perfect. Max grinned from ear to ear the entire day. Lena was his favorite person in the world, and he said so loudly in front of everyone, declaring that she was the best big sister ever. No one corrected him. No one needed to. That night, after the guests had left and the balloons had sagged, Daniel found Lena cleaning up the kitchen, humming softly. "You've got a knack for this," he said with a chuckle. "For throwing parties. 4. Making people feel like they matter." She smiled, her hands stilling on the dish towel. "I learned from you." He shook his head. "No. You brought your own kind of light here, Lena. I just gave you the switch." In early May, Women Rising invited Lena to speak at a local conference on survivor advocacy. It was the kind of event she would have once run from, but she accepted the invitation. The night before the speech, she paced the living room nervously, practicing in front of Daniel and Max, stumbling over her words, second-guessing herself. "I don't know if I can do this," she said, gripping the note cards tightly. Daniel stood and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've already lived it, Lena. Speaking it is just the echo, and you're stronger than the silence ever was." The next day, she stood on stage in front of more than 100 people and told her story. She spoke of betrayal, escape, fear, but also of love, hope, and second chances. She didn't name Daniel outright, but she spoke of a man who had opened his door without asking questions, and a little boy who had given her a reason to believe in family again. When she finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat. Then it erupted into applause. A few weeks later, Daniel received a letter. It was from a state agency. He frowned at the envelope, worried it might be something else overdue. But when he opened it, his breath caught. It was notification that Lena had listed his name as her legal guardian for emergency contact and financial aid purposes. He stared at the form, reading the fine print over and over. Later that evening, he found her in the backyard, watering the small garden she had planted in early spring. "You listed me," he said, holding the form. She turned, unsure for a moment if she had done something wrong. I didn't mean to upset you." "You didn't," he interrupted, voice hoarse. I wasn't expecting it." She walked over, kneeling beside where he stood. "You've been more of a father to me than the one who gave me life. You never had to do what you did. But you did. You saw me when no one else would. You gave me a name again. A home. A reason." He sat down beside her, unable to speak for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, "You're my daughter now. In every way that matters." Lena didn't respond with words. She simply leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. They sat like that until the stars came out. By the time summer returned, the house was no longer a refuge. It was a launch pad. Lena passed her second semester with honors and was offered a part-time position with Women Rising. She accepted. She began mentoring younger girls in the system, some still terrified, others numb with defeat. Lena met them where they were, gently, without pressure. She shared parts of her story, always ending with the same truth. You're not what happened to you. You're what you choose to become. Daniel continued working, though he reduced his hours at the school to spend more time with Max, who was thriving at school, thanks to Lena's nightly reading sessions. The boy who had once clung to his mother's memory now looked ahead with unshakable joy. And every time he called for Lena, every time he hugged her goodnight, Daniel felt that joy sink into his own soul like sunlight after a storm. A year after Lena arrived in the rain, they gathered on the porch for dinner. Just the three of them. The table was covered with grilled corn, chicken, and a pitcher of lemonade. Max had just finished telling a wild story about a class hamster escaping, and Lena was laughing so hard tears rolled down her cheeks. Daniel watched them both, the flicker of fairy lights above their heads casting a golden glow, and felt something so full in his chest he could hardly breathe. She had come to him broken, silent, and afraid. Now she was bold, laughing, full of purpose. She had thought she was the one being rescued. But it had been him all along. Because before Lena, the house had felt like a tomb. Now, it was a sanctuary, a place where miracles didn't shout. They whispered, they healed, they grew. And in that quiet miracle, Daniel finally understood that family was not made by blood, but by love chosen daily, through compassion, sacrifice, and the kind of courage that rises not from strength but from hope. And Lena, she wasn't just a girl he had saved. She was the miracle that saved him right back.